Happy belated St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day was a couple days ago this week, and I thought for fun, for our little dive into history of culture, psychology, and humanity, because this is, after all, the podcast of humanity. Well, that's not our catchphrase. That's somebody's catchphrase, huh? Hey, call in and tell me who I stole that from accidentally. I think that's some other podcast. So anyway, I thought that I would talk a little bit about something fun in Irish American history, which is the archetype, perhaps stereotype. We'll see what the difference is between those two things, of the Irish police officer, something that I don't know if it permeates culture as much as it did when I was a kid, but it used to be so many police officers on movies and TV were Irish. And you, I think, still see, even if there's not the thick brogue or thick accent of Ireland that there always were in the movies and TV shows of my youth, that it is still something that is common in fiction to show that. And I thought we'd take a look at what is that really, and where did that come from? And, why is it here? And where is it going after it dies? Anyway, so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. First off, want to make sure to mention this month's highlighted charity, which is CHIRLA, CHIRLA.org. That is the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, which is doing a lot of work, and particularly doing a lot of work right now here in the United States to help immigrants to secure and be aware of their own legal rights, as well as just advocating for humane treatment of those immigrants. There's lots out there to be very concerned about, and so going to chirla.org is one way for you to learn about the efforts that are being done. You can see on their website, they've got not only places where you can support and donate, also places where you can find some of their projects and links to different places where you can find news stories and things. There are a whole host of things that you can share with other people, even if that is all that you have time or resources to do at this point. If you have a little more resources, then please feel free to support and give. See if they have things in your area where you can volunteer or do stuff or whatever. And speaking of Patreon, which I will be right now, if you join the Broken Brains Patreon, 50% of your donation every month will go to CHIRLA to help for that cause, as is always the case for any new members of Patreon. Every single month that you are a member and donating, then half of your donation will always go to the charity that was the highlighted charity in the month in which you joined. If you do go also to Patreon, you get bonus materials. If you are a free subscriber, you will get videos of the interviews that we are doing that will be sent to you as well. If you are a paid member, you get all kinds of bonuses, including the last half of today's episode. That's right, our weekly history episodes, this story of his story that we're going to get into. You always get a sample of that here on the main feed for everybody, and then you will get the whole burrito, the whole enchilada, the whole bangers and mash. That's English, not Irish, I think. Anyway, you get the whole thing over on Patreon. So there you are. So our topic today takes us to the mid to late 19th century. That's right. In the later 1800s, there were a lot of Irish immigrants that were coming over to the U.S., and this ties in a little bit with our charity focus too, doesn't it? It's about immigration. I think that when we look at immigration today, we sometimes forget that all of us, virtually, once upon a time, just about everybody, had a hard time as far as divided into racial groups. There were many that had a hard time coming in as immigrants and were treated very, very badly. There was an influx of Irish individuals that were coming to the United States. It was the time of the Great Famine over in Ireland, and that caused a lot of people to immigrate to different areas. And with the promise and the thought of jobs and a different kind of a whole experience in the United States, many immigrated into the United States, coming into a situation of abject poverty and looking for different jobs and different ways to fit in when there was a great amount of anti-Irish discrimination that was going on. Irish people were not trusted because they were Catholic, many of them, historically, in their families as well, and even if they weren't individually, that was assumed. Also, German and Irish immigrants both faced what we would now think of as a very odd type of discrimination, which was against drinking. That many of the festivals or many of the family traditions, basically Irish people were known for drinking whiskey in early America, and German people were known for drinking beer. And those two things and anti-immigrant sentiment were utilized in order to pass prohibition, which caused a lot of, great times. Actually, no, bad times. So there's a lot of concern that was there, and that was one of the things that made it very hard for people to find work in that area. And not everybody was able to just punch people and horses really hard like Tom Cruise's character in Far and Away. So there was that. At the same time, in the late 1800s, as I was saying, there was an influx of Irish men being hired into local police departments. Police departments in these areas that were becoming quickly more and more urban. Think Gangs of New York, urban, or whatever. We'll talk about that just a little bit. But there was a more need for, behavioral enforcement, policing, and as we're going to talk about too, there were a lot of competing forces that were behind the societal enforcement of rules and the social order, much of which did not have to do with benevolent policing or community-oriented policing. There was also a lot of corruption. And so therefore, there were many reasons why there needed to be an influx of people into this industry of policing. And Irishmen excluded from many other professions, even really low-paying day labor positions, were available to do this. Also, there were many connections that some, with a lack of jobs and a lack of economic resources, that there was a lot of mingling with Irish immigrants and some of the criminal elements. People were looking for ways to eat and feed their families. And so you had kind of a connection, a weird societal connection between people just being available, oftentimes growing up and living in rough situations, that they were maybe not as intimidated by mixing it up in what became could be very, very violent gang demonstrations. And then you had the other side of that, which was those who were entangled already with some of the corrupt local governments and some of the crime that was happening, who were thought of as very valuable by those people to have into a position of power. So this is something that was a very interesting thing happening, probably very good for a lot of individuals, and also deeply problematic, which is what we see whenever we have an enforcement arm of the government. There is room for corruption, and there is room for bad decision making. One of the things that affected, and guys, you might see a few things that tie in with maybe some of my thoughts about modern America too in this. One of the things that stood out to me as I was going down the rabbit hole looking at this was that one of the problems that became of this was that there was such a need and or perceived need to bring people in to law enforcement that many were brought in with no training. Now think of that. A lot of people brought in with no training. The other thing is that they were also enlisted to enact enforcement of laws and also to harass other groups of immigrants. So this was a very, very dramatic role reversal where Irish individuals were pulled into these roles, and then they were being ordered to Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and Black Americans. And there were lots of violent riots. There was also, once again, a lot of crossover with the growing Irish criminal mobs and the government. There was a lot of money moving around. Once again, those who reach out and take, then they just get used to taking. And that's how that works. Think The Godfather, except Irish. So once again, you can think Gangs of New York. Although, was he Irish? Isn't that one of the questions they ask? You can also think of the guy who was the bad mobster on the movie The Sting with Robert Redford and Paul Newman. He was Irish. So there you go. Anyway, aside from all that, there was a lot of really, really epidemic violence and brutality that grew from this. So you take a group that is disenfranchised and angry and feeling a lack of resources, you move that group and you give a subgroup of those individuals power, some authority, and order them around and tell them what to do. And then people will do what they need to do to try to hold on to what they view as a secure economic position. And also, then it becomes more the norm with the corruption, for the law enforcement to be utilized to enforce societal norms and laws that are not being made for the good of society in this time in particular. So you can see where there's a lot of elements of things that we still deal with problematic elements of law enforcement communities today. And yeah, think about that. Untrained individuals being brought in to harass immigrants. There are many traditions that came from Irish culture. There were what was called emerald societies, which were formed amongst law enforcement communities in particular for Irish cops. And they're also introduced some traditions that you still see today. Bagpipes, for example, at police funerals. Not uncommon today as well, whether or not the officer is Irish. You do see some of those elements that have just become really, really bound to the culture of law enforcement as well. One of the interesting things that deserves its own sort of little history deep dive is the Tammany Hall element that existed in New York State and New York City. Tammany Hall was an organization, a political organization, that really sort of put a lot of the thrust into governing over in New York City in particular, is what it was known. And if you're familiar with that history, just a little dip into it, William M. Tweed was one of the leaders of Tammany Hall. That's when there was a lot of corruption, and just basically, if you hear the phrase Tammany Hall, even like me, who largely has not known much about it in my life, I know that it means top hats and corruption, and they're all out of top hats. And Irish-American organizations, as well as connections to the police department, were very, very useful to Tammany Hall. There was a lot of interplay between that. William H. Tweed was guilty of graft, corruption, lots of things like that. And once again, so you get those that rise to power, those that take power, and oftentimes take power violently or through political backstabbings and just ins and outs of those kinds of dealings. Once people get a hold of power, they do not like to let it go, and they will turn around and step on the people that are around them who are in the same situation that they were before they took the power. This is just the way, unfortunately, that it seems to go. Whether it is that human nature, I tend to think no. I tend to think that it has a lot to do with the societal structure of, do we have a win-lose type of capitalism? And I'm not here, people want to talk about different ways capitalism can be practiced. I think a win-loss where you have to step on the neck of somebody else to climb a little higher is definitely not the type of American capitalism that we should have, if you even believe in capitalism in these days. That's a whole nother discussion, everybody. You can see a lot of these kinds of things popularized in fiction as well. If you're familiar with Bill the Butcher, who was portrayed by Daniel Day-Lewis in the movie Gangs of New York. He's a, corrupt gang leader, dips into and controls politics and the local police force in that movie. He's also a butcher. And I don't know if Daniel Day-Lewis got all method into that. I don't know if he really cut up pigs. I wouldn't be surprised if he did that. I don't know if he really stabbed people or became discriminatory against Irish people. But this character was based on a real dude, William Poole, who apparently was called Bill the Butcher. He was a butcher, and apparently I think the biggest difference that I was able to find between the real guy and the movie guy is I don't think he was nearly as successful as the fictional character, and actually died in 1855, which is a little bit before a lot of the things that we're talking about in today's little history dive. So once again, like any historical fiction, it's not very real. But he was also known to be very anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Catholic and anti-Irish. I think there's some clues. I've heard people talk about in the movie that there's clues or whatever, that there's rumors that he might have been a self-hating Irish person himself, or had some Irish blood that he resented in his own heritage. Anyway, I don't know all about that. So now, a lot of the violence that occurred during this time actually occurred centered around times of elections, which is another interesting thing where you see the tie-in between where the police force might be deployed to take care of certain things, to control the voting and to control the attitudes around it. And when people would push back, there was a lot of violence in those times when people were trying to control political outcomes. So once again, there are problems that we can still see that have persisted from the early system of enforcement and the early system of power grabbing in our country. We're going to step away now from the regular feed. For those of you that are patrons of the show, you get to hear the rest of this over on Patreon or on the Patreon feed if you're subscribed to that, or it'll come in an email. Whatever, if you're listening to it in a few seconds here, you will have already done it. So thanks, everybody, for listening. And now let's get into teaser, a little bit about William S. DeVry, Bill DeVry, or as I like to call him, Bell Biv DeVry. And also, one of the things that you patrons are going to get to hear in a minute is a dive into some modern advocacy through Irish individuals who actually have done some advocacy for freedom and equality that we're going to get into. The first half, there was a lot of looking backwards at the forced corruption and infighting over power that was happening amongst immigrants to the U.S., and we're going to talk about another side to that as well. But so now we bid a fond adieu to those who, that's how Irish people say goodbye, adieu, and to those of you who are on the main feed. And let's go, patrons.